We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 63b. On the previous Amud, the Brisa said that if a Levi sells a property to a Yisrael, and the Levi says he wants the Ma'aser Rishon to be his, so that stipulation is effective. And the Gemara explained the reason why that stipulation is effective is because we assume the Levi is retaining some of that property, the property which will have the Ma'aser Rishon. He's retaining that part of the property for himself. You can't say that he's actually acquiring the produce, which is Ma'aser Rishon, because that produce doesn't exist yet. You can't make a kinyan on something that doesn't yet exist. And so the idea is, again, he's retaining some of the property for himself. And Reish Lakish said, you see from this brisa that let's say you would have a situation where a person would sell a house and he would say that he wants to retain the diyota, the upper story, for himself. That stipulation would be effective. And the Gemara now continues, Lamai Hilchasa, for what halacha exactly is Reish Lakish saying this halacha? And the Rashbam explains, Lamai Hilchasa, Amar Reish Lakish diahani tanoi. Reish Lakish is saying that the stipulation is effective, Lamahave diyota elyona shalo, that now the upper story remains his, it remains the seller. So what do you need to say the stipulation for at all? Belav hachihu shalo, isn't it his anyhow? To hamocher habayis, because when someone sells a house, lo machar diyota elyona, the standard understanding is that you're not selling the upper story. So what exactly is Reish Lakish adding? There must be something that this stipulation is doing beyond just giving the seller the diyota elyona, the upper story. And the Gemara says, Rav Zvid Amar, Rav Zvid says, Shemurotza lahotzi bazizin motzi, that if he wants to put projections, to have things project out of the upper story, he's allowed to do that. That's the right that the seller is giving himself. And the Rashbam explains, Shemurotza mocher lahotzi zizin midiyota elyona keneged chotzer shalokeach. Let's say the seller wants to have zizin, he wants projections, things to stick out from this diyota elyona, and they're going to be opposite the chotzer, the courtyard of the buyer. Shemocher lo zehabayis v'achotzer motzi. He's allowed to do that even though the buyer has the courtyard and, so to speak, that airspace. He could still use that airspace and have these zizin that are sticking out. That's what the stipulation really was effective for. This is really what the seller is telling to the buyer. I want the upper story to be totally mine. To do what I want. I want to be able to have zizin come out from it like I was originally before I sold you the house, before I sold you the bayis and the chotzer. The shayir b'tanoi mokom b'chotzer. Essentially what he's saying is, through this stipulation, I have a certain area of the chotzer that's mine. Just like the case of the field, where the Levi is saying he wants a portion of the field that has the makom meiser, that has the place of the meiser rishon. The point over here is, anytime you have a condition which it's not really doing anything in terms of exactly what he's saying, because anyway he would have that, so it is going to be effective to let the seller retain some of the rights of the location. That's the zosomeres of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is saying, we see from the case of Ma'aser Rishon that the stipulation is helping him to retain some of the property, and the same thing is happening over here by the diyota elyona. And the Rashbam continues and notes, V'daf kahu, now this stipulation only works for him. He's allowed to put out the zizin. Avol beno, but for example his son, ein lo rishos lahotzi zizin. He would not have that permission to put out the zizin, ad sheyafarish liyu levane, unless he actually says me and my son. He has to say specifically he's including his son. Kida amar le'el gavi meiser, that's exactly what we said before by meiser. T'chol milsa dedaikinan mi yisura dai lanu yahani yisura liatzmo, because anytime we're learning something from extra language, it's only going to be for himself. Kimo shapirish al menashe meiser rishon shali, just like we said by Ma'aser Rishon. Hachanami amin al menashe diyota elyona shali, the diyota elyona is his, it's mine. Avol lebanav lo mahani tanai hamayusar, but for his children, that extra part of the tanai is not going to help unless you specifically include the children. And the Gemara continues with another approach to understanding Reish Lakish. Rav Papa Amar Rav Papa says, Imratza livnos aliyah al gabo, the stipulation helps for the following. Let's say he wants to build an upper story on top of it, bona, he is able to build it. And the Rashbam explains, Rav Papa Amar Rav Papa says, Kuli hai lo ahani tanai l'shayir mokom imasha machar. It's not true, it doesn't go that far. The stipulation is not going to allow him to have space beyond that, or take space rather from that which he sold. He sold the space, and now he wants certain rights to that very same space which he sold. That Rav Papa says we don't go that far. Rav Papa does not agree with Rav Zvid in that regard. Rather, the extra tanai, what helps is for as follows. What it helps for is as follows. Shemroza livnos diyota zu im tipol al gavo shel habayis bona. The way the Rashbam understands is, let's say this diota would fall, and he wants to rebuild it on the house. So that's what the stipulation is effective for. This is how we're going to explain Rav Papa later on. The Gemara will clarify this in the next daf. That if it falls, he can rebuild it. Now, let's say he wouldn't have said any stipulation. He would have just sold the house. So then he would have the diota el yona as long as it's still around. But if it would fall down, he wouldn't be able to rebuild it on top of this house. Because he only gets this diota, but he doesn't get an extra. He doesn't get another diota, meaning let's say this one falls, he wants to rebuild. Unless he says specifically this extra language. That's how Rav Papa learns from the extra language. And the Gemara continues, B'shlomo l'Rav Zavid, we understand Rav Zavid's explanation that the idea is he's allowed to put out these zizin. Hainu dekotani zos omeres. Then the zos omeres makes sense. It's a direct analogy to the case of the Ma'aser Rishon by the Levi who's selling the field. El Rav Papa, but according to Rav Papa, where the idea is you can rebuild the diota, my zos omeres, what's the zos omeres? It doesn't seem to be exactly parallel to the case of the Brisa before. And the Gemara says, Kasha, the Gemara says that is indeed a difficulty. And the Rashbam explains, B'shlomo l'Rav Zavid de'uki yisura detanai lahotza Aziz, and I understand according to Rav Zavid, who says the extra part of the stipulation is for the fact that you can put out zizin. Dahainu shir mokom b'chatzar. That means to say there's an area of the chatzar that he's retaining for himself, meaning the seller is retaining for himself. Domya d'shir mokom b'sada. That's similar to what's going on by the field by the Levi. Hainu dekatani b'milsa Reish Lakish zos omeres shehutzrach Reish Lakish lilmon min haBrisa. Makes sense. He's learning. Reish Lakish is learning from the Brisa. It's the same kind of halacha. Telahani yisur l'shir mokom. The idea is the extra language means he's retaining some of it for himself. To misvara lo have amrinan to mishayer, because we wouldn't say misvara, we wouldn't say just logically to mishayer initially atzmai masham ocher that a person is leaving for himself from what he sold. V'afagav dekamer yisur, even though he said something extra. So we're learning it from the Brisa. Elul Rav Papa, but according to Rav Papa's explanation that you can rebuild my zos omeres. What's the zos omeres? Has nothing to do with the case of the Levi. Lama lo Reish Lakish lomar zos omeres lashminan dahani yisur lachzor v'livnos hadiota. What are you saying? This proves that now he's allowed to rebuild it in people if it falls. Below haBrisa nami havi yadin, and even without the Brisa, we could have understood that. The Yahani Yisor Tanai, She'eno Tzarech L'Tzefuye Mil. So the idea is you say something extra, so therefore it's, if you didn't need it, so then it's coming to add something. O Hadar Rav Papa O Shum Davar B'Yolim. It's going to add something, either what Rav Papa said or something else. Kedamrina B'Mas Nisan, like we say in the Mishnah. Umod Rabbi Akiva B'Zman Shamar L'Chutz Me'elu. She'en Tzarech Likach Lo Derech. A similar idea Rabbi Akiva says, if you add on a phrase, it's going to add something. Mehasam Shaminan Dechol Tanai Below Tzarech L'Tzefuye Mil Sakasi. We already know this idea that if you add a Tanai that you didn't need to add, that it adds something. So you're not learning anything from, that's just an idea, you're adding something. We want to learn from the Brisa that you're adding something similar to the case, by the case of the Levi who's selling the field. When we Brisa lo shaminan late fame mas nisan, you won't learn anything more, according to Rav Papa, you don't know that any more from the Brisa than you do from the Mishnah. We say earlier also that phrase, Elaine Mitzranaha, we said on the previous summit, it adds something. I should have said, Reish Lakish should have just said the halacha. There's nothing specifically we're learning from the Brisa according to the way Rav Papa is understanding Reish Lakish, and the Gemara says indeed that is difficult. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rav Dimi min Nahardoi. Rav Dimi from Nahardoi says, "Hayman de mazvin le beis lechavri." If somebody sells a house to his friend, afagav de chosav le umka veruma. Even though he writes when he's selling the house, he writes that he's selling its depth and its heights. Tzarich lemichtav le knilach mitahom ara viad rumraki. He still needs to write in there that you're going to acquire from the depths of the earth until the heights in the sky. And the Gemara explains, my time, what's the reason? Do umka veruma bestama lo kani. Umka veruma in general, you're not going to get together with the house. Ahani umka veruma lemikna umka veruma. And so therefore, if you would write in umka veruma, that would just help in order to acquire umka veruma, the depths and the heights. V'ahani mitahom ara v'adrum rakia. And so therefore, when you put in the extra phrase of tahom ara v'adrum rakia, that helps lemikna bor v'dos and mechilos. That helps in order to acquire, let's say you have pits or cisterns or caverns. And the Rashbam explains, Hayman de mazvin le beis lechavri. If a person sells a house to his friend, umachar lo games habor v'yasados. And the point over here is, he's selling him also the pits or the cisterns or again the tunnels. V'tzarech lo lichtov b'shtar ha'mechira kain. He has to write this into the document. Avagav dechasav le b'shtar umko v'rumo shal bayis ani mochalach. Even though he does write in the shtar that I'm selling you umko v'rumo, which means again the depths and the heights, lo kana bor v'dos. That's not enough to acquire the pit and the cistern. Kinam efarish v'yazal, as will be explained explained, to lo ahani mashakas of umka veruma ela lemikne umko shel bayis. When we say umka veruma in a shtar, that means the umko shel bayis, meaning kagon guf hakarka atzmo, meaning let's say the actual land lachbor tachas karkois habayis. Let's say he wants to dig under the land of the house. If he wants shimlo kasav lo have a kani le mistam. If he wouldn't write that, he wouldn't be allowed to dig. Ela harehu shel mocher would actually be the seller's right. Lachbor boros shichon amoros, to dig underneath, to dig pits and to dig cisterns and caves. Mitachas karkois habayis, from underneath the land of the house. Ela shelo yazak lebal habayis, he just has to make sure he doesn't do any damage to the owner of the house. V'gam ahani le lemiknei ruma, the same thing goes for the ruma, the heights. Kagon gag sheyesh lo makashu gavoa yud. Let's say you have a roof that has a fence which is 10 tvachim high. She'eno mocher mistamem habayis, that's not automatically sold together with the house. Kedektani masnisa, like it says in the Mishnah. V'gam liknos kol ha'avir adler rakia she'im yirtze livnos bona to mistamalo have a kani lelokeach. Also, let's say to acquire the airspace all the way up to the heavens, that if he wants to build, he can build. It's not automatic that the lokeach gets it. Ela hareyu shel mocher, really it would be the seller's load. So asazizin o livnos ba'avir. Let's say he wants to have projections over the airspace or build in the airspace. Ukegon shelo yachbed al beis shel lokeach, as long as it doesn't crush the house of the buyer. Avolamikni bor v'dos shein tashmishan shavel abayis. When it comes to the acquiring of the pit or the cistern, which is not the same use of the house, that's not even included in the phrase omko veruma. Again, omko veruma is if you want to give him the rights to dig, the rights to build. But when it comes to the actual bor v'dos, for example, he's not going to acquire that unless you write in the extra language of me'aris tahoma, meaning mishule hatahom, from the depths ad l'rakeh, until the heavens. V'yahani hai me'aris tahoma lemikni bor v'dos u'mechilos, and that's what the phrase me'aris tahoma would help for. Now he could acquire the pit or the cistern or the tunnels. V'hayad rom rakia lo mahani le midi. Now when it comes to adding in the phrase ad rom rakia, that doesn't help at all. The mishakasav lo umka veruma kani ad rom rakia, because once you write umka veruma, you do get up to the heavens. V'lo itzrich klal, that's not needed at all. Elasof diborhu, that's just the end of the phrase. When you say from the depths, you say from the depths until the heights. The lo matziyamar me'aris tahoma ad shipule besa, the mashma de lo zavelim yishipule habayis l'malaklum. You can't say from the depths all the way until the floor of the house. That wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't sound like he's getting above the floor of the house, and so therefore you have to say until the heights, but that's not really adding anything. The point is, it's the extra phrase that's going to give the buyer the right to the pit or the cistern that is underneath the house. And the Rashbam continues, Hachi Garcin and my time umka veruma bistama lokani. Again, umka veruma in general, you're not going to get that automatically. Adam mefarish umka veruma, unless you say umka veruma. V'hilgach lo ahani umka veruma lemahave yisur lashon. Therefore, umka veruma is not like extra language lemikni bor v'dos in order to acquire the pit and the cistern, the legufa itzrich, because it's already needed for itself, meaning that he should have the rights to dig, etc. When it says in the Gemara, even though he writes umka veruma, that's going on bor v'dos, he doesn't get the bor v'dos from the phrase umka veruma. But in terms of a roof that has a fence, gavoa yud, which is 10 tvachim high, lokai, we're actually not going on that. Because it happens to be that if you write the phrase umka veruma, you will get the roof. We're only focusing here on the bor v'dos. That's going to be made clear later on. And the Gemara continues, Lema Messiah, let's say a support for what Rav Dimi said from the Mishnah that's coming up. It says, Veloes habor, veloes hados. He doesn't include in the sale the pit and the cistern. Afal pisha kasav lo umka veruma. Even though he writes umka veruma, that's not included in the sale when you sell a house. And so the Gemara says, Visalka daitach bistama kani umka veruma. Now, if it was true that bistama, if nothing is written, you automatically get the depths and the heights in terms of the rights to dig under the house. So lahani umka veruma lemikni bor v'dos u'mechilos. So then the phrase umka veruma should help to acquire the bor and the dos and the mechilos. And so you see from the fact that it does not help him to acquire the bor and the dos and mechilos that Rav Dimi is in fact correct, that umka veruma only helps you to get the rights, let's say, to dig underneath of the house, but in order to get the bor and the dos and the mechilos, you would need to have an extra phrase. And the Gemara continues, it's not necessarily a proof from the Mishnah coming up. The low cost of because actually in the Mishnah coming up, it's talking about a situation where you didn't actually write umka veruma, and it could be that if you wrote the phrase umka veruma, he would be able to acquire the bor and the dos in that situation. The Gemara says, well, how could you say that? It says in the Mishnah, even though he did write umka veruma, he's not going to get the bor v'dos. Now you're saying that Mishnah is talking about where he didn't write the phrase umka veruma. And the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, this is what it means to say. You could interpret the Mishnah coming up as follows. follows, Afal Pisha lo kasav lo, even though he didn't write the phrase kavruma, Kemisha kasav dami, it is as if he wrote it, lemikna kavruma, in terms of acquiring the rights to the depths and the heights, meaning those rights do come automatically, even without the phrase kavruma, and so therefore, lemikna bor vidos umechilos, as far as acquiring the pits and the cisterns and the tunnels together with the house, kasav le kavruma kani, if he writes the phrase kavruma, he will get the bor vidos, vilo kasav lo kani, and if he doesn't write that, he will not acquire. And so the Gemara is saying that it could be the Mishnah is not necessarily like Rav Dimi, rather the Mishnah is saying if you write the phrase kavruma, then the buyer actually will acquire the bor vidos. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from the Mishnah, Hagag, it says that the buyer, when he buys a house, he does not acquire the roof together with the house if there's a fence there that is 10 Tvachim high, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Dalid Amud Aleph.